Good morning, I'm Adam Sexton. State Democratic Party fundraisers here in New Hampshire usually draw big-name keynote speakers, but they don't always draw national headlines. Last weekend, it was someone who wasn't on stage who ended up stealing the show after pressing Senator Jeanne Shaheen from the audience over her deal to help end the government shutdown. The man speaking up is a candidate for Congress in the 1st District, Heath Howard, state representative, and he's our guest this morning on Close Up. Representative, thanks for being here.
Thank you for having me, Adam. I appreciate it.
So you're there at the Eleanor Roosevelt dinner. Did you go with a plan to say something during Senator Shaheen's speech, or were you just moved in the moment?
No, I was very moved in the moment. You know, this is something that is very deeply personal to me as a member of the disability community, and it really angered me to hear the senator's words, and I did feel very betrayed.
Explain that. There's a lot of anger in the Democratic base here, but where was the healthcare victory on the horizon in that shutdown?
Yeah, I mean, it seemed like we were approaching an opportunity. I mean, after huge victories that Tuesday before with election wins across the country, from California to New York, New Jersey, we were able to win across the country, and yet it felt as if our Democratic senators sold us out when we had a lot of strength.
Hey, explain, though, you know, if you were in the senator's shoes right now in that position, theoretically the shutdown would still be ongoing, the government's still closed, you're approaching potentially being accused of wrecking the holiday, Thanksgiving travel would be snarled, a lot of people who may not even care about the shutdown would suddenly be blaming people in Washington for wrecking their Thanksgiving. Your message to them would basically be, you know, hang in there because we think we can bring Republicans to the table to negotiate, when they were saying they wouldn't.
Well, I think that we are kind of in a situation where it's a different scenario than what could have happened. And it's a hypothetical. I do think that, you know, there was a lot of pressure on Republicans to come to the table to make a deal, and by just accepting a handshake negotiation, we were completely failed in that regard.
So in terms of heckling Senator Shaheen, you did what you know is so hard for so many people in these congressional district races, which is get some attention. You've got the attention. Now, what are the policies you want to bring to the table there in D.C.?
Yeah, well, I mean, I do think that we need to do more for healthcare. I mean, the ACA only goes and does so much. We need to expand and make sure that we're fighting for a universal healthcare system that works for all Americans, that's free at the point of use, so that people can actually get the care that they need, so that they're not worried about whether or not they're going to be able to pay their bills or go and see a doctor, but make sure that they can just stay healthy. I also think that we need to expand educational opportunities. We need to make sure that we provide free trade schools and tuition-free public universities for the next generation, because we see time and time again in countries that have implemented these programs that there are extreme economic benefits to them pursuing them. I also think that we need to prevent a number of these private equity firms from boxing out single families from the housing market. We see these private equity firms come in, slap $100,000, $50,000 over asking price on these single family homes, and people can't compete with that. There's not an opportunity for these people to come in and be able to purchase that single family home. And I think that we need to put a moratorium on these giant private equity firms from being able to purchase them, because single family homes should be, for the name, single families, and so individuals should be the ones primarily purchasing them. I also think that we need to raise the minimum wage, because $7.25 is not enough. You know, as one of the states that does have a $7.25 minimum wage, I've talked to a lot of employees, I've talked to a number of workers across the state, and I hear time and time again that they're not being able to be paid enough, and it's very troubling when you are able to go across state lines and be able to be paid nearly double what the minimum wage here in New Hampshire is.
Circling back quickly to single-payer health care and debt-free college, how do you pick up the tab on that? That's trillions of dollars.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's quite simple. We have the money to pay for it now. We have large corporations that are being given huge tax subsidies and breaks, and yet, you know, when you look at some of these companies, they're turning around and telling their employees how they can qualify for federal assistance. And I think that these companies that have the money to do this, that make billions of dollars in profit, can afford to pay for their employees' health care. And if they can't be trusted to do that, then the government needs to step in, tax them accordingly, and make sure that we provide these. And, you know, as I said, there are huge economic benefits to pursuing these programs, because at the end of the day, these people, they'll have more money in their pockets to be able to provide into the economy. And we need to be thinking about how we can uplift everybody.
There are a lot of progressives running in this first congressional district primary. What makes you the progressive pick over, say, a candidate like Christian Urrutia or Carly Barrientos or the others?
Yeah, well, I mean, it comes down to experience. You know, of all the candidates in the race, I'm the one with the most experience as an elected official, which, you know, I personally find a little bit comedic. But, you know, at 25, I've won a very competitive district in the New Hampshire State Legislature, one that was the third closest district in the entire state this past year. And it's one that we've seen Governor Sununu win, Governor Ayotte win, Trump won half of it. But I was able to win by 16 votes because I had to talk to Republicans, Democrats, independents, people who are politically disillusioned, and I was able to get them to come out and support me. And I think that it's building those coalitions that is extremely important. And I've done the same thing in Concord as well, where I've been able to build coalitions. I was the second most active Democratic legislator in the House this past year. I had 28 of my bills pass our chamber. I had 7 signed by the governor, and I'm very proud of the work that I've been able to accomplish. But it's being able to put our nose to the grindstone and actually get things done. And I've been able to prove that in multiple different ways.
Yeah, obviously your experience comes as a benefit. That voting record, though, and you get involved in a lot of different issues, that can be a double-edged sword, especially if you make it to the general election. We're going to see Republicans likely attack a vote. In particular, you voted against the ban on genital gender reassignment surgeries for minors in 2024. That's now law. Why do you believe, say, a 16-year-old should be able to have a sex change surgery?
Yeah, so when we're talking about, you know, trans rights, I do think that it's an individual issue, and it's one that needs to be approached on an individual case-by-case basis. And it's something that when we have legislation like that that is so broad sweeping, you're not able to make those small exceptions. And that's where I think that we need to come back and look at what the individual needs of an individual are, because at the end of the day, if somebody is able to get the surgery and it prevents them from committing suicide, I'd much rather have them get the surgery than no longer be with us.
Simply for the mental, you wouldn't want them just to have mental health treatment. You'd prefer that they have a life-altering surgery as a teen.
I'm not saying that, you know, across the board. I'm just saying it's a situation that needs to be handled on a case-by-case basis.
Let's turn back to policy in Congress. A lot of people, including the Pope, are taking issue with how the Trump administration is carrying out immigration policy, in particular in reference to deportation of illegal immigrants. But Democrats have lost voters, too, in past elections for being essentially too lenient on this issue. Do you believe that an illegal immigrant who commits a crime should be deported?
I think that they need to be handled accordingly, and I mean, I think that deportation is one way of going about that. However, the way that the Trump administration is handling these mass deportations, I don't think that that is a good policy to pursue. It's one that I think is very detrimental and one that is, frankly, unconstitutional. I mean, the 14th Amendment is very clear about birthright citizenship. It's very clear about due process, and it's very clear that every individual, not just citizens, are entitled to that due process.
Should they be deported, though? These are all criminals who commit crimes. You're a yes or a no?
I think that, again, it comes down to the case-by-case basis, and if that individual is a danger, then it is a possibility that they can be deported, yes.
On energy policy, this has become more and more of a political football as well, especially when it comes to green energy. Should Congress be trying to speed up the transition away from cars and trucks that run on gas and diesel towards EVs?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, I think that we are in a unique position right now where we need to be very cognizant about how we pursue energy policy. And I think that the EV opportunities and businesses that are currently popping up do have a need to be supported. And I think that there is definitely a market that is growing, and I think that this is one of the industries that tariffs could be used on. Because if you look at China in particular, they have a huge head start when it comes to the EV market, and I think that that's a good example of where, you know, the American market needs to catch up.
On the issue of the war in Gaza and Israel, you've been very vocal that this is a genocide. In your opinion, what would have been the appropriate response by Israel to the October 7th attacks?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if they had gone in and isolated the assailants in the October 7th attack and were able to take them out as well as retrieve the hostages, there would be far less blowback. Because at the end of the day, with what happened after October 7th, the Israelis went in and were, as I have been very clear about, you know, performing a genocide. They were attacking innocents and people who were not there to do anything but just survive. And I find it very, very troubling that the United States is still willing to support them in such a manner.
Quickly, Zohran Mamdani, is he the future of the Democratic Party? Do you see democratic socialism as something that could re-energize the Democrats?
I think people like Zohran Mamdani are definitely the way forward, and it comes down to the type of energy that they're bringing to the table, and I think that that's really important. I think that, you know, the types of policies that we need to be talking about, the ones that I've been very open about on my campaign, are what we need to be talking about to re-energize the voting base that we need to come out and support us in November.
All right, Heath Howard running for Congress. We'll see you out there on the campaign trail.
Yep. Thank you, sir.
All right, and we'll be right back with an expert on Kratom, the herbal supplement being targeted by more local communities due to its opioid-like effects in high doses.